number of forts and castles. So we acknowledge especially our members of parliament from these constituencies. We also acknowledge the respected Mr. Benjamin Crump, civil rights activist. We acknowledge Reverend Al Sharpton. We acknowledge our friends from the United Nations multilateral establishment, distinguished invited guests, ladies and gentlemen. We gather here today in remembrance of millions of Africans whose lives were violently truncated by the transatlantic slave trade, a system that for centuries reduced our forebears to commodities and turned entire societies into sources of labor and unjust profit. Across the shores of West Africa, including in my country, Ghana, the stone walls of forts and castles such as Cape Coast, Elmina, still stand as silent witnesses to this vast machinery of human exploitation, through which more than 12 million Africans were captured, forced across the Atlantic, and subjected to racialized chattel enslavement. Before we speak of justice, policy, or diplomacy, it is fitting that we pause to honor the memory of those men, women, and children whose suffering under this system helped shape the modern world while denying them the most basic recognition of their humanity. Earlier today, we were honored to have His Excellency John Dramani Mahama, President of the Republic of Ghana, lead us on a solemn commemorative remembrance at the African Burial Ground National Monument here in New York. We honored the memory of men, women, and children whose lives were shaped by the transatlantic slave trade. To see that the international community is gathered here today to reflect on the enduring legacy of this profound injustice, convened on the eve of the International Day of Remembrance of the Victims of Slavery and the Transatlantic Slave Trade. This high-level event offers us an opportunity for the global community to confront history with honesty, to honor the resilience of those who endured unimaginable suffering, and to reaffirm a shared commitment to reparatory justice and healing for Africans and people of African descent. In convening this high-level gathering, Ghana does so with a deep awareness of history and responsibility. Along our coastline stands the forts and castles through which countless Africans passed before the long and brutal journey into enslavement. These sites remain enduring reminders of a crime that shaped the destinies of continents and peoples. In the 15th century, ships began arriving on the shores of the Gold Coast in what is today the Republic of Ghana. From that moment, a dark chapter in human history began to unfold as Africa became the epicenter of a vast system of human exploitation that would reshape societies across continents. It is therefore no coincidence that this story began on the shores of the Gold Coast, a land long associated with the rising sun. If the sun rose over the beginning of this tragedy on our shores, then it must not set on the conscience of humanity until justice is done. It is therefore with humility and determination that Ghana, in its capacity as the African Union champion on advancing the cause of justice and the payment of reparations for Africans and the people of African descent, has sought to provide a platform for renewed international reflection and dialogue on this defining chapter of human history. Excellencies, the legacies of slavery continue to resonate in the present across societies and programs, illustrate how societies are seeking to safeguard these records and ensure that voices long silenced by history are documented and remembered. It is within this broader context that today's high-level special event has been convened. The gathering offers the international community an opportunity to reflect collectively on the historical realities of the trafficking in enslaved Africans and the racialized chattel enslavement of Africans, to reaffirm our shared commitment to justice and equality, and to deepen dialogue on pathways toward reparatory justice. It also provides an important platform for listening to diverse voices, scholars, advocates, young activists from the New York Reparations Committee, and many others who continue to support President Mahama's initiative. As we begin today's discussions, we do so mindful that remembrance carries responsibility. Honoring the victims of this tragedy requires more than recalling the past. It calls on us to recognize the humanity that was denied to them, deepen our understanding of this history, and strengthen our commitment to building a world in which dignity, equality, and justice are upheld for all peoples. Before I conclude, Your Excellencies, let me express Ghana's appreciation to His Excellency Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of the United Nations, for generously supporting this initiative and permitting Ghana to convene this important high-level gathering here at the United Nations. I also would like to specially commend His Excellency John Dramani Mahama for the guidance, the vision, the courage, and the resilience in leading the African continent, all people of African descent, and indeed, all people with good conscience in our world on this historic path to reparatory justice and restitution. Posterity will certainly be kind to President Mahama and all of us in this room who remain committed to this defining process. It is my hope that today's dialogue will deepen our collective reflection and strengthen our resolve to confront the legacies of the past with honesty and to advance the cause of justice for Africans and all people of African descent. I thank you very much.
We thank you, Honorable Minister for Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Ghana, Sam Okujeto Ablakwa. It's now my pleasure to call upon the Commissioner for Health, Humanitarian Affairs, and Social Development from the African Union, Her Excellency Ama Chum Amwa.
Thank you. Your Excellency President John Dramani Mahama of the Republic of Ghana, Osaberi Kwesi Atta II, Uguaman Hene of the Cape Coast Traditional Area, Honorable Ministers, Chef de Cabinet of the UN Secretary General, Excellencies, Permanent Representatives of the United Nations Member States, representatives of peoples of African descent, esteemed members of UN, AU, and CARICOM reparations mechanisms, distinguished scholars and experts, ladies and gentlemen. I have the honor to address this distinguished gathering on behalf of the chairperson of the African Union Commission. He conveys warm fraternal greetings and expresses deep appreciation for the convening of this high-level event, which brings together leaders, partners, and stakeholders united in advancing justice for Africans and people of African descent. While the chairperson is unable to be present in person, I am deeply honored to convey his statement on his behalf, reflecting the collective voice and unwavering commitment of the African Union to the cause of reparatory justice. Kindly permit me, therefore, to deliver the statement of the chairperson of the African Union Commission. And it reads, "It is a profound honor to address you at this high-level event on reparatory justice for the trafficking of enslaved Africans and the racialized chattel enslavement of Africans. I wish at the outset to express high appreciation to His Excellency John Dramani Mahama, President of the Republic of Ghana, for his leadership in convening this important meeting and for his invaluable contribution and custodianship as the African Union leader on advancing the cause of justice and payment of reparations to Africans and people of African descent. I also wish to recognize the invaluable of the Republic of Togo for the leadership in hosting the 9th Pan-African Congress in Lomé last year and in tabling the successive AU Assembly decisions on qualification of slavery, deportation, and colonization as crimes against humanity and genocide against peoples of Africa. We meet today not only to remember what was done to Africa and her scattered children, but to act together so that history's open wound becomes a site of healing, reconstruction, and renewal. I wish to highlight that in my annual report earlier this year to the Assembly of Heads of State and Government of the African Union, I stressed that reparatory justice is no longer a peripheral moral appeal. It is now a structured continental program anchored in our Agenda 2063 and its second 10-year implementation plan. Through Assembly Decision 884, our leaders designated 2025 as the African Union theme of the year, Justice for Africans and People of African Descent through Reparations. This transformed reparations from department organ, specialized agency, and liaison office carries part of this responsibility. Pursuant to the mandates given by our Assembly and Executive Council, we constituted and convened the African Union Committee of Experts on Reparations and the African Union Reference Group of Legal Experts on Reparations, whose inception meeting in December 2025 developed substantive framework papers and working groups on legal foundations, modalities of reparations, and global advocacy. These mechanisms signal a simple truth, that Africa is organizing for justice. Excellencies, distinguished participants, at the political level, our Assembly has spoken with unprecedented clarity. In Decision 934 of February 2025, and reaffirmed in February 2026, the Union has decided to call their recognition as such at the international level. This is a watershed moment. To name these atrocities clearly is to remove the last veils of ambiguity from the historical record. It is to say, as the African Day of African Matters and Victims of Transatlantic Slave Trade, Colonization and Apartheid, the Republic of Togo, in coordination with the Commission, convened fight against structural global asymmetries. In that sense, reparations are like restoring a river whose source needs replenishment. They involve not only ensuring the water downstream, but also transforming the systems that cause the shortage to occur, so that new injustices do not perpetuate old ones. Excellencies, our partnerships with the wider African diaspora are central to this vision. In 2025, we operationalized the AU Curriculum Memorandum of Understanding on upscaling engagement with people of African descent. And together, we convened the second Africa CARICOM Summit at the African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa, a declaration on transcontinental partnerships in pursuit of reparatory justice for Africans and people of African descent through reparations, which our Assembly has adopted this year as a guiding framework. This partnership has now expanded further, with restorative justice being one of the main pillars of the first CELAC Africa Forum, which has convened in Bogota only last week. In practical terms, we are building a transoceanic architecture of solidarity so that the descendants of those scattered by the enslavement ships can now sit together at the captain's table of global decision-making. We have also stepped up our engagement with the United Nations system and contributed to the adoption of key resolutions in the Human Rights Council that place reparatory justice at the center of multilateral deliberations. We are now leaping to another front under the leadership of His Excellency John Paul and 934. For the first time, we are also preparing to host a session of the UN Permanent Forum on People of African Descent on African soil at the AU headquarters in Addis Ababa. These steps show that Africa does not come to the UN only as petitioners. It comes as non-entrepreneur, as a continent determined to co-author the rules of global justice. Excellencies, distinguished participants, allow me in closing to offer 3 invitations to this distinguished audience. First, the energy of the defendants of reparatory justice across the globe. Africa, once diminished on maps, now insists on being seen at its true scale. Geographically, historically, morally, culturally, economically, diplomatically, and globally. The journey from enslavement to justice, from colonization to liberation, from apartheid segregation to equitable integration is not yet complete. It must pass through the path of reparatory justice to reach true equality. As Kwame Nkrumah reminded us, we face neither east nor west. We faced forward. Today, that forward path is clear, but to correct its conscience. I thank you.
We thank you, Her Excellency Commissioner Ama Chum Amwa from the African Union. Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, in just a moment, we are going to have the keynote address by the President of the Republic of Ghana, which will be coming from the podium there. But before that, I'm going to plead with you, if you have the little earpieces, to deploy them now, because the next speech is coming in Portuguese, and my pleasure to welcome to speak to us the Republic of Angola. Minister, the floor.
Was the greatest barbarity committed against Africans. It left deep colony in the Americas, was of Angolan origin. Between the 15th and 19th centuries, many Angolans were captured and exported in a barbaric manner to perform slavery, as well as the other territories under them, as well as to the promotion of democracy, culture, and political and civil rights at the global level. Reparatory justice is not a favor in projects that promote balanced development and the inclusion of Africans and people of African descent, ensuring the prosperity of African nations. It is furthermore crucial to ensure that the financial resources illicitly removed from Africa can be returned and allocated to the constructions of infrastructure and to other projects identified and defined by Africans themselves for their development. It is unacceptable that such resources, so necessary for Africa's inclusive progress, particularly for its youth, continue to be withheld from Africans.
Parts of the world, distinguished guests, it is my honor, my privilege right now to introduce us to the African champion or African Union champion for reparations, His Excellency, the President of the Republic of Ghana, John Dramani Mahama. Can we welcome
That was quite a surprise.
And
Yeah, but thank you
officials.
for that beautiful display of African
The chairman
culture.
for this occasion, the
Osabere
chef de
Ma
cabinet,
Kwesi
Kwesi II,
who's the paramount chief of the Ogoa traditional area. Reverend Al Shapton, thank you for joining us at the African Burial Grounds this morning. And then enslaved by people who believed they could own those human beings as chattels, as their personal property. Some will hear this and think I'm splitting hairs. Isn't that the same thing, they might ask? No, it's not. Not at all the same thing. Not if you acknowledge an individual's humanity. Not if you respect an individual's basic right to dignity. The entire transatlantic slave trade was designed to deny African people their humanity. And that denial was premised on a racial hierarchy with no basis in fact or science, a racial This resolution allows us as a global community to collect 12.5 million men, women, and children whose homes, communities, names, families, hopes, dreams, futures, and lives were stolen from them over the course of 400 years. I speak these words today not only for Ghana, but also in solidarity with the rest of Africa, the Caribbean, Latin America, and the wider diaspora, and indeed all people of good conscience throughout the world. This resolution is a pathway to healing and reparative justice. And a few who preferred death to captivity voluntarily jumped overboard. It is believed that 10 to 20% of enslaved people died in the Middle Passage. Whenever a ship arrived at its destination, the enslaved people, still naked, stock. They were then placed on an auction block in front of an audience of potential buyers, arrived on the plantation where they would work and live for a lifetime. They were also stripped of their names. And so you were no longer Fatu, or Kofi, or Bubakar, or Nanayao, or Menka, Nayong, or Hamisu. You were given names like Ben, Jemima, John, Toby, or Mary. In addition to these new names, they were also called girl or boy, regardless of how old you were. And maybe I should also say that filthy N-word. If you ever needed a surname, it would be that of your master. And sometimes they were branded like cattle with the plantation's insignia or logo. There were sugar plantations. There were also coffee, cotton, tobacco, and cocoa plantations in the Caribbean and the Americas. South America had diamond and gold mines as well. And also the production of indigo took place in Jamaica. The people who were enslaved and the conditions under which they worked were brutal. They were beaten. Arrived to the 19th century when chattel slavery was eventually abolished. America grew from 3 colonies to an independent nation with 36 states. Over 450,000 enslaved Africans were trafficked to Barbados, an island that is 34 kilometers wide and 34 kilometers long and 23 kilometers wide. Before the trafficking of enslaved Africans, plantation labor in Barbados came from white indentured servants who were usually Irish. There were two major problems with indentured servants. One was that they eventually had to be granted their freedom. And the other was that if they ran away, catching them proved challenging because they blended in. And it is important to note that many enslaved women were impregnated because they were dead, even in cases where a baby was not the product of rape, was to strip the child of its paternity in the eyes of the law. That child, as an enslaved person, was property that could be given or sold at its owner's whim. The doctrine was adopted throughout the Americas, including in Brazil. People sometimes try to put a disclaimer on slavery by insisting that you cannot use the social norms of today to judge the actions and events that took place in the past. Well, such people are loud and wrong. Just because everybody is doing something doesn't make it right. Slavery is wrong now, and it was wrong then. For as long as Africans have been trafficked and enslaved, there have been abolitionists who have spoken up against it. The first slave ship landed in America in 1619. Opposition to chattel slavery was voiced and mentioned in passing in documents, but erasure begins with language, when words are used as a sleight of hand to gaslight, to trick you into doubting what you know to be true. It is when words are used to create mythology. When they are spoken, the volume gradually decreases with each repetition until it becomes a full verbal reduction. The legendary American jazz player Miles Davis said, "We've descended into mines to unearth precious metals and stones, and we have wet nurse babies. We've paid the price of admission with the blood of our ancestors, and still what greets us at the door is silence. What we're met with is mythology." And I'll explain what mythology I mean. In 2015, McGraw-Hill Education, one of the largest publishers in the United States, released a geography truth of slavery, segregation, and racism in whose budgets rely in any way on public funds are being prohibited from scheduling exhibitions and programs or from displaying materials promoting racial awareness or Black history. Much like the law that was put in place to regulate the punishment of the enslaved in Barbados, these policies are becoming a template for other governments as well as some private institutions. At the very least, they are slowly The great Jamaican philosopher-poet Robert Nesta Marley famously said, "Emancipate yourself from mental slavery. None but ourselves can free our minds." I want to repeat an encouragement that I offered as part of. In his book, the Guyanese writer Walter Rodney quotes a Dutch traveler's first impressions upon visiting the. When you enter into it, you go into a great broad street. The town is composed of 30 main streets, very straight, 120 feet wide. The houses are close to one another, arranged in very good order. These people are in no way inferior to the Dutch as regards cleanliness. Sente Pegado traveled to the city of Great Zimbabwe And this was what he wrote. He said, among the gold mines, and I hope all of you will vote tomorrow to establish truth so that together we can pass this historic resolution and finally acknowledge the full horrors of these transgressions against humanity of the approximately 15 million human beings who were enslaved. I thank you very much for your attention.
We thank you, President John Dramani Mahama of the Republic of Ghana, in his capacity as the African Union champion on slavery and reparations. We thank you very much in the audience for this section or this portion of the discussions. We are now about to break into a more in-depth, a more detailed, a more captivating part of our proceedings here today. And we still crave your attention because I am about to hand us over to a very distinguished woman who is a historian. She is a historian. She is a rapporteur of the African Union Committee of Experts on Reparations, Dr. Panashe Chigumadzi. I hope I pronounced that right. Maybe I should be a Zimbabwean and say Maswita. Thank you very much. Over to you, Dr. Chigumadzi. Thank you.
Good morning, Excellencies. All protocols observed. I want to take a leaf from our Osajefo, who has given us a wonderful It never happens that the hippo's child is eaten by the crocodile and the pool remains still. There must be consequences. There must be historical accountability. This is the Ubuntu, which many of us grew up with and lived with. This is the philosophy that anchors the AU framework for reparations, a crime does not rot, 1444 to present, which I have the honor of serving as the rapporteur. It is a radical vision of the African philosophy of Ubuntu that demands reparations and consequences. It insists that when a crime is committed against a child, against a people, the community, the world cannot remain still. The waters must move, the mothers must rise. And this is rooted in Pan-African legal philosophy of intergenerational consequences of crimes, shared across philosophies such as Ubuntu. Across the continent, our ancestors declare, Ichala aliboli, mulato hauboli, reparations movement. Now, importantly, today we wage part of the intellectual struggle of correcting the historical record. 250 years ago, in 1776, Adam Smith declared in his seminal Wealth of Nations that the rounding of the Cape of Good Hope and the so-called discovery of the Americas in 1492 were the two most important events in the history of mankind. Smith named geography, he named navigation, he named global commerce. What he did not name, what he could not bring himself to name, was the engine that made this possible, the trafficking of enslaved Africans. Adam saw the world, or Adam Smith rather, saw the world that the crime built, and he described it as if the crime had never happened. Without it, there was no capital to finance the voyages, no labor to extract the wealth, no system to sustain empire. The ship's route was not the rupture, the enslaved bodies in the hull were. Similarly, Hannah Arendt, in her seminal The Origins of Totalitarianism, argued that 20th century Western totalitarianism constituted the fundamental break in European civilization. Of course, Amy Césaire demonstrated that Hannah Arendt was wrong. This was merely the boomeranging of colonial procedures back onto Europe. And of course, we know the Westphalian Canard, that modern sovereignty and political modernity began with the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. The AU framework intervenes in these historical debates about the origins of the modern world and corrects the record center. It names the inception of the trafficking of enslaved Africans during the so-called Age of Discovery as the definitive break in world history, the event that shattered localized feudal orders and inaugurated the modern world racial capitalist system, transforming the fates and fortunes of all peoples across the world, both during and after slavery's legal end. Event, but the environment, the structure and the condition that make event, but the environment, the structure and the condition that make all life as we know it possible. In the Americas, indigenous peoples were dispossessed and eliminated to clear the land. Enslaved Africans were forced to extract its wealth, and communal territories were recast as private property, hardwiring racial domination into the foundations of modern capitalism. In Europe, the capital extracted from the plantation funded the Industrial Revolution and transformed the European peasant into the modern industrial proletarian. In Asia, the profits of the Atlantic trafficking financed the consequences or conquest of India and the Opium Wars in China. And when abolition came, the plantation infrastructure was simply restructured or simply restocked with indentured Indian and Asian labor. In Africa, the removal of the most productive generations shattered sovereignty, militarized economies, and laid the ground for the scramble for Africa. The global backlash to emancipation epitomized what it meant when Europeans stopped stealing Africans from their lands and began stealing the lands from Africans. That plantation logic was brought to Africa. In my own southern Africa, the infamous compound mining system was the engine of the 19th century minerals revolution, which created the monstrous wealth of men like Cecil John Rhodes. Moreover, what is most important is that that system, the compound mining system, was directly modeled on Brazilian slave mining systems. Slavery was not a metaphor, it was the blueprint for development both before and after abolition. The Masters and Servants Acts that dominated apartheid labor relations up until the 1970s were first introduced after abolition in the 19th century to discipline free labor across the British Empire. Long before Adam Smith theorized the beginnings of the modern world, our ancestors understood that this was world-breaking and world-redefining. They said it in our languages before any Western academy named it. In southern Africa, when settlers came, our ancestors cried, "Ilizwe lifile," the world is dead. It was not only that black people suffered a social death, but the land and the world suffered death too. On the Swahili slave coast, our Africans cried, "Kifa urongo." This is what Toni Morrison meant in 1988 when she said, "Slavery broke the world in half. It broke it in every way." She was not speaking metaphorically, she was making a structural argument, the same argument that the AU framework makes. This is not a competition of suffering. It is a recognition of a world that is broken and requires a world-making and world-rebuilding reparations agenda. A cardiologist who identifies the heart as the organ failure, which causes systematic collapse, is not ranking organs. We're simply naming the beginnings of the rot. It is a structural diagnosis. And the question, what does it add that moral suasion cannot? We will then hear for 30 minutes from our four respondents, Reverend Al Sharpton, Dr. Amara Inya, Mr. Benjamin Crump, and Professor Vereen Shepherd. Starting with round one, we have Professor Edem Adote, who will give us the historical origins, helping us understand what exactly is exceptional in the break that we identify in 1444. Professor?
Good morning, everyone.
Oh, let me give you your bio. It is Professor Idem Adoche, who is Associate Professor of African History at the Institute of African Studies, University of Ghana. He's a Pan-Africanist scholar with special interests in the transatlantic trafficking of enslaved Africans and European colonialism in Africa. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. Thank you, His Excellency. All protocols observed left us, which is the issue of terminology. And I think this is very important because it helps to put in proper historical context the issues we are discussing today. In most of the history textbooks that we read, we see the subject matter described as the transatlantic slave trade. But this obscures a couple of issues, and I'm just going to deal with three of them. One is the fact that when we talk about the transatlantic slave trade in quotes, we are talking about two related but separate issues here. One is the slave trade, and two is slavery. These are related but separate, and it's important that we make that distinction. And again, it's important we raise that because when it comes to the history of the transatlantic slave trade, the slave trade was abolished earlier, and it took several decades for the slave-owning nations to abolish the institution, which clearly tells us that these are two separate issues that we are dealing with. So, for example, Britain, for instance, abolished the trade in 1807, but abolished the institution in 1834. And even then said that enslaved Africans had to be apprenticed for 4 years before they acquired their freedom. Similarly, Denmark, which was one of the very first nations to abolish the trade, did that in 1803, but it took a slave rebellion in their Danish plantations in 1848 for the institution to be abolished. So we are talking about two issues here, and we need to pay attention to that. The second point that I want to make has to do with classifying the subject matter as a trade, because it gives the impression that we are just dealing with a normal economic routine of buying and selling of goods or products. But that is not necessarily the case. We are talking here about the forcible seizure of people whose productive and reproductive standard, this is just not a normal trade that we're talking about. And I'm happy that on the brochure, we're talking about trafficking of enslaved peoples. This is not a trade that we are talking about. It is important we address that. And the third point that I want to highlight has to do with the issue about African slaves. And again, that is also very important because some apologies for the transatlantic slave trade, again in quotes, make the argument that many people in Africa were already slaves when they came here. So what they did was just to feed into an existing trade or institution and just took off people who were already slaves. So what they did to them was actually rather benefiting them because there was nothing special about what was happening. But in as much as the institution of slavery existed, and there's going to be another discussion on the nature of what existed here, these people who were taken were not necessarily slaves. Many of them were free people who were captured, forcibly seized, and shipped across the Atlantic. So we are not talking about African slaves here, we are talking about enslaved Africans, and I'm happy that is also captured in the title. And to re-emphasize the point that these were not African slaves, but people who were enslaved, as our president rightly pointed out. We see that these people rebelled right from the very onset, from 1441 when the first group of Africans were taken away, right through the 15th century. We find King Afonso in the Congo writing to the King of Portugal protesting why free people were being taken away. We have instances of the rebellions in the Americas, the Maroon Age. We talk about even the slave wars in Golu, in the Upper East region of Ghana. All these instances show that these people were not goods, neither were they trade items, but these people were humans who were free, who wanted their independence. And right from the onset, they resisted their enslavement, and it's important that we put this in proper context. So that is the first that I want to discuss. The second also has to do with the origins. Again, it's also about some historical inaccuracies in the records that we we use. Now, many of us are told that the Europeans came to Africa and were trading in gold till about, and the need for labor because the indigenous people could not produce the kind of labor that existed. This is historically inaccurate. Right from the onset when the Portuguese came in the 15th century, they were kidnapping and shipping Africans across to Europe. So the enslavement, the kidnapping and enslavement of Africans started way before plantation slavery in the Americas. And the other important point I also want to make is that this issue of enslavement of Africans also occurred in Africa before it was transported across the Atlantic. The Portuguese and the Spanish had plantations on the coast of Africa. We talk about Sao Tome, Canary Islands, we can talk about Cape Verde. All these places were plantations that the Portuguese and the Spanish employed or used enslaved African labor to produce sugar and other products in these spaces. So when we talk about the Europeans being around for a while and being trading in just what we later call legitimate goods, gold and other products, this is not wholly accurate. Right from the onset, they were stealing Africans and shipping them across. They were pillaging societies and creating havoc in all these places, and it's important that this historical information is also put out there. The third point I would like to discuss has to do with the structural organization of the so-called trade. As I pointed out, these were not slaves, these were free people who were enslaved. So we need to understand how the African became a slave, what I call the making of the African slave. This involved four stages. 1, acquisition; 2, captivity; 3, use; and 4, treatment. And I think the most important point I want to make is that this was systemized, this was systemic enslavement of Africans. And the reason why I make this argument has to do with the origins and the role that institutions played in organizing this trade. For instance, right from the onset, there were debates in European parliaments regarding the shipment of Africans across the Atlantic. It is interesting to know that between 1619 and 1714, there were 16 parliamentary sessions in the British Parliament debating whether to have a joint stock company or open trade in enslaved Africans. Now, beyond that, there were also agreements between nations to determine who should supply enslaved Africans to their colonies in the Americas. So again, for instance, in 1713, there was an agreement between Spain and Britain, what we call the Asiento, granting it a monopoly on enslaved Africans for its colonies. And under it, they were supposed to supply 4,800 enslaved Africans per year for 30 years. So we see the kind of relationships that existed that enabled these enslavement of Africans. The third also has to do with laws on the treatment and use of these enslaved Africans, who were primarily treated as chattel, as property. And many of you will know of the slave ship Zonk, which in 1781 let's say that the captain threw overboard over 100 Africans on the ship and actually went on to claim insurance for the number of people that had been thrown on the slave ship, which clearly told you that there were laws that enabled some of these things to take place. Of course, later on, it was thrown away, but the first instance, he won. Now, beyond that, we also have black codes or the slave codes that were all over the spaces that regulated the kind of relationships that existed between enslaved peoples and their masters. Many of them reinforced the idea that these people were property. So it's not surprising that many of the rules that we find in this period have several enslaved people as part of the property that are bequeathed to their heads. So you find a spoon, a table, a land, cattle, and you find in there a Kwame, or a John, or a Ben, or something else. And this clearly tells you how these people were treated primarily as chattel. Now, these are some of the key issues I want to raise for now. But the most important point I would like to conclude with is the fact that when we talk about this trade, again, trade in quotes, in enslaved Africans, we are just not talking about a normal trade. We are talking about humans, and I think that is always forgotten in the conversation, that we are talking about humans whose consent was neither sought in these exchanges, whose labor, reproductive and sexual, was exploited without compensation for centuries. And it's important that we put at the center of this conversation the human beings that we are talking about. And what makes this trade, again in quotes, unique was the fact that it was racially based, it was permanent, it was hereditary enslavement of Africans, and the trafficking of Africans across the Atlantic, and the enslavement also set the foundation for the racialized, exploitative global regime that persists today. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor. And we'll come to the gendered aspect, and one, just to make sure we understand that gender doesn't necessarily mean woman, just like race doesn't mean black. We have to think very expansively about what the slave trade meant, or rather in trafficking in enslaved Africans. And as we heard from the president, that in 1662, the Virginia enacted an unprecedented legal principle, partus secutiv interim, which for the first time in human history made the status of enslavery heritable through the mother's womb. So working in a long line of black radical feminist thought that has placed the experience of black women at the center of analysis of racial capitalism, not as a special case, but as a clarifying instance. Professor Morgan, your scholarship has established that this was not a secondary provision, but the system's reproductive engine, the very mechanism through which the trafficking made itself permanent and self-sustaining across generations. Can you establish what this specifically inaugurated, why it is central rather than supplementary to the world that the trafficking built, and importantly, how does that logic continue to shape the world today? For example, you might reference the so-called Moynihan Report in the 1960s, in the post-civil rights moment, and the ways in which black women are continued to be figured as emasculating or the center of the destruction of black families. How does this logic begin with slavery? And I just want to give us a little bit of background into her phenomenal scholarship. Professor Jennifer L. Morgan is a historian at New York University specializing in slavery, gender, and the Black Atlantic. She is a 2024 MacArthur Fellow, Genius, and Mellon Fellow at the New York Public Library. She's best known for Reckoning with Slavery, which was published in 2021, and Laboring Women, published in 2004. Her scholarship examines how race, gender, reproduction, and capitalism shaped systems of slavery, and her work on reproductive racial capitalism has become foundational to understanding the system that the break built.
Thank you so much. And I'd like to begin with just humble thanks for the invitation to participate in this morning's crucial and historic event. As you have noted in the section of the Declaration on the progressive codification of the racialized chattel enslavement of Africans, one of the markers of the transatlantic slave trade and the hereditary racial slavery that infused the Atlantic world beginning in the 15th century was, and I'm quoting the Declaration now, the unprecedented biologically inheritable status of property through the womb of enslaved women, close quote. So it's this distinction that I want to elaborate for you here this morning, building on what you've already learned in this room from His Excellency President John Dramani Mahama. In 1662, the legislative body of the Virginia colony, Englishmen known as the House of Burgesses, met and passed the following law. Whereas some doubts have arisen whether children got by any Englishman upon a Negro woman shall be slave or free, be it therefore enacted and declared by this present Grand Assembly that all children born in this country shall be held bond or free only according to the condition of the mother. This law did two things. It punished interracial sex, but more importantly, it clarified the status of all children born to black women. The women who were laboring in the 17th century black Atlantic world, whose status became part of how Europeans decided that enslaving Africans was both legal and moral. And they did so through the kind of legislative and practical maneuvers that the 1662 law both sheds light on and clears the way for. The Virginia legislators passed this law at a moment when there were actually very few enslaved Africans in the colony of Virginia. Although more than 1 million people had been captured and transported to the Americas by 1660, enslavers in Virginia, as in much of the rest of the 17th century mainland North American colonies, had only just begun a journey towards developing the full-scale slave societies that would develop in the American South and the embrace of the slave economy that would characterize colonies in the North. But they knew what they were reaching for, and they understood the significance of black women's bodies in the architecture of what they were building. Slavery had long existed in Africa, in Europe, in Asia, but this thing that we are grappling with today, this was new. And the Virginia legislators offer us some insight into how hereditary racial slavery in the Atlantic world both developed and was codified. Because it was more than simply attaching slave status to the children of the enslaved. That too had occurred. This was naturalizing the status of enslavement, locating it not in warfare or captivity, but in an embodied commodification. Because the act transformed human beings from captives into naturally produced commodities. When the members of the House of Burgesses legislated that the condition of the child followed that of the followed that of the mother, they removed that child from the family and they placed that child in the marketplace. We should remember that there were many legal routes through which a child conceived out of wedlock could be did. This law took its form and its cadence from English common laws that concerned animal husbandry, that assigned the ownership of a calf to the owner of a cow, not the owner of the bull. The violence attending this law is multi-layered. It removes from the slave owner's legal and moral framework his paternal relationship with the child he conceives on the body of an enslaved woman, certainly. That child becomes his property, not his progeny. But we shouldn't linger entirely on the specter of interracial violence because, again, to quote the Declaration, racialized chattel enslavement was historically unprecedented in its legal and structural design, being the first global regime to codify human beings and their descendants as inheritable, alienable, and perpetual property, to convert human reproduction into a mechanism of capital accumulation. Atlantic slavery began with the Middle Passage, with the capturing and loading of human beings on board ships, transporting them in chains across an ocean. The 1662 law offered slaves through their bodies. It enacted a violation that is frankly mind-boggling, as it is rooted in the claim that kinship, that most fundamental of human relationships, did not apply to Africans or people of African descent. Toni Morrison wrote in 1988 that slavery broke the world apart. It broke it in every way. We could talk further about what it does to legislate that a black child is not part of a family, but is a commodity that enriches the family of the white people who own her. About the fact that a black child's banishment into the public, into the market, is part of the ideology that helps Europeans define themselves as white, as deserving of private life, as free. The slave owner's child will inherit the slave owner's property. It's a distinction that is soaked in the blood of the black child, whether she is the actual daughter of the slave owner or not. But I am not here to talk about the white family, but to talk about the descendants of captive Africans, to talk about what it means to try to name the violations that are at the heart of the structural realities that hereditary racial slavery produces. In my focus on reproduction, on birth, rooted in the Moynihan Report's claim that black families are without any are sites of chaos, or whether it's in the fact that African American women today are 4 times more likely to die in childbirth than white women in this country. The aftermath of that logic persists. As we fight to define the Atlantic slave trade and the hereditary chattel slavery that it produced as the gravest crime against humanity, we need to grapple with how it is embedded in a world-changing deployment of reproductive